Scorpio knows the person who distanced themselves from you. It wasn't indifference, it wasn't coldness, and most of the time, it wasn't even about you. You spent months, maybe years, trying to decipher a silence that seemed to hold an answer that never came. And the worst part wasn't the distance itself. It was not understanding why someone who seemed so present, so intense, so deep inside you, simply stopped being there. If this person carries the energy of Scorpio, there's a mechanism behind this distancing that almost no one from the outside understands. Because Scorpio doesn't distance themselves because they don't feel anything. They distance themselves precisely when they feel too much. And that changes everything. Think about it. Most people withdraw when the bond cools. Scorpio does the opposite. He disappears the moment the bond heats up, to the point of threatening the control he exerts over his own vulnerability. It's not running away from the other person. It's running away from himself, from what the other person has awakened in him. There's a scene that repeats itself, almost like an invisible script. At first, the intensity is overwhelming, a gaze that seems to pierce through layers, questions that no one else asks, the kind that force you to be honest until it hurts a little. Scorpio enters your life like someone entering a dark room without fear, searching for what's hidden behind the furniture. And for a while, you feel like the most watched place in the world. But this very ability to see deeply is what at some point turns against Scorpio itself. Because seeing too deeply into another inevitably means seeing too deeply into oneself. And there, something gets stuck. Why does someone seeking depth retreat precisely when they find it? That's the question most people never get around to asking, because they're stuck on another, more superficial one. What did I do wrong? It's almost never that. Scorpio's withdrawal rarely stems from a mistake on your part. It stems from an internal mechanism of emotional survival that existed long before you entered their life. Scorpio carries, almost instinctively, the memory that opening up completely has come at a high price at some point. Not necessarily in their love life. Sometimes it's an old wound from childhood, from a first betrayal, from a moment when total surrender resulted in pain, and the body, the psyche, the nervous system learn a silent lesson. The deeper I let someone in, the greater the risk of being destroyed from within. So when you get close enough to touch that spot, something in it recognizes the pattern even before the mind processes it. And the protective instinct takes over, not as a conscious choice, as a reflex. That's why a Scorpio's withdrawal has such a different texture from a common withdrawal. It doesn't come with obvious anger, nor always with explanations. Sometimes it comes wrapped in silence, in shorter answers, in a presence that seems to have been replaced by a more distant version of the same person. And you're left there, trying to understand what changed, without realizing that what changed was precisely the closeness you had achieved. There's a detail that almost no one notices in this process. Before truly retreating, Scorpio usually tests things out. A sharper comment, a calculated absence, a question that seems designed to push you away before you push them away first. It's not malice. It's a defense mechanism, trying to figure out if what they feel is worth the risk of remaining exposed. And if you reacted to that test the wrong way, without even knowing you were being tested, something began in that silence. But what exactly was Scorpio trying to protect when it distanced itself from you? It was while searching for answers to this that I found this digital book, not as someone looking for a ready-made formula, but as someone who is tired of staying on the surface of generic explanations that don't address what really hurts. The divine wisdom that guides your zodiac sign to a purposeful life doesn't treat Scorpio as a stereotype of mystery and jealousy. It delves into exactly where you are now, trying to understand the invisible mechanisms that cause someone to protect themselves by withdrawing, and shows how to transform this pattern into awareness, instead of blindly repeating it forever. More than just reading material, it's a mental attitude. It's the decision not to stop at the first comfortable explanation, to delve deep until you find the root of a behavior, the way any Scorpio does by instinct, even when it's uncomfortable. You're probably still processing something as you listen to this, perhaps recognizing in yourself or in someone you love that same movement of withdrawing precisely when intimacy becomes real. This discomfort you feel now is not without reason. It's a sign that something within you already knows it needs to truly understand this, not tomorrow, not when you have time, but now, while this wound is still accessible and willing to be faced head-on. The link is in the first pinned comment. But be aware, this content may be taken down. Click now and download your copy. Tell me in the comments, is there someone in your life who always walks away just when things get too intense? What was it like for you to experience that pattern? He was trying to protect the only thing Scorpio considers sacred, the right to choose when and to whom to fully surrender. Because there's a huge difference between being invited to open up and being caught off guard while opening up. And when that difference is lost, when intimacy happens too quickly without him having consciously decided to allow it, his body interprets it as an invasion, even if he was the one who approached first. This seems contradictory, and it is. Scorpio seeks depth with a hunger that few signs possess. But the moment that depth ceases to be a choice and becomes exposure, the same desire that brought him to you transforms into a threat. And the distance you felt wasn't the end of his interest. It was his body trying to regain control over a vulnerability that advanced too quickly. There is an armor in Scorpio that is almost never visible from the outside. It is not made of indifference or calculated coldness. It is made of strategic silence. While other signs process emotion by talking, arguing, asking for help, Scorpio processes emotion alone, in the dark, almost as if any witness to that process could contaminate or weaken what is being rebuilt inside. Therefore, when he withdraws, it's not the moment when he's coldest towards you. Paradoxically, it's the moment when he's most immersed in himself, trying to understand what he feels before risking showing it. And while this is happening from the outside, it seems exactly the opposite. It seems like abandonment. Herein lies one of the most silent power mechanisms of the zodiac. Scorpio learned at some point in life that whoever controls proximity controls their own emotional security. It's not conscious manipulation. It's learned survival. If they decide when to approach and when to retreat, they will never again be caught off guard by pain they didn't see coming. And it is precisely this control, this invisible architecture of protection, that makes their distancing seem so calculated, when in reality it is instinctive to the core. And what happens when that armor, built to protect, starts hurting the very people he most wants to keep close? This armor that protects also isolates, and understanding where protection ends and self-sabotage begins is precisely the kind of inner work that the divine wisdom that guides your zodiac sign to a purposeful life helps you do. The material shows, with language that respects the intensity of Scorpio, how to transform instinctive control into conscious choice without losing the depth that makes this sign who it is. The last promotional copies are limited, and the content may be removed at any time. If you recognize this armor in yourself or someone you love, now is the time to go beyond the surface. The link is in the first pinned comment. The last copies are running out. Click now and begin your journey towards the clarity and genius you deserve. There is a recurring cycle in the emotional life of Scorpio, so constant that it almost seems like a law of nature. First comes intense surrender, then the wound, real or imagined. Next, the symbolic death of that version of themselves that they allowed themselves to trust. And finally, a rebirth, a harder, more selective version, more difficult to reach next time. This cycle is not a weakness. It is the very mechanism of transformation that makes Scorpio the sign most associated with metamorphosis in the entire zodiac. However, lived without awareness, this cycle can repeat itself forever, each time with higher walls, each time with fewer people capable of crossing the distance it itself builds. And that's where the great paradox lies. Scorpio, more than almost any other sign, wants a connection that isn't superficial, one that doesn't fall apart at the first sign of discomfort. But the same process they use to protect themselves from potentially painful connections is what prevents true connections from surviving long enough to prove they are different from those that have hurt them before. He pushes away precisely what he needs most, because in the heat of the moment, he can't distinguish between a real danger and the memory of an old one. Psychology calls this a conditioned response. Astrology calls it the shadow of Scorpio. Ultimately, they are the same thing seen through different lenses, a protection system so efficient that it began protecting the wrong person from the wrong danger at the wrong time. If you've ever loved someone like that, or if you are that person, you've probably felt it firsthand. The sensation of being simultaneously pulled close and pushed away by the same person, almost at the same instant. It's not a confusion of feelings. It's the war between the desire for connection and the fear of what that connection might cost, happening within the same heart. And there's a question that almost no Scorpio dares to ask aloud. What if the danger I so fear repeating no longer exists? What if the person in front of me now isn't the same one who hurt me before? Distinguishing between past and present dangers is one of the quietest and most liberating tasks there is. And it is precisely this kind of discernment that the divine wisdom that guides your zodiac sign to a purposeful life helps to develop, chapter by chapter, showing how each sign carries repetitive patterns that can be recognized and, ultimately, rewritten. It's not about ceasing to be a Scorpio. It's about stopping repeating an old pain, thinking you're protecting yourself from a new one. Access to this content is limited and may be taken down without notice. If this battle of getting closer and pushing away has tired you, now is the time to break the cycle. The link is in the first pinned comment. The last copies are running out. Click now and begin your journey towards the clarity and genius you deserve. Scorpio's silence almost never means what it seems to mean from the outside. When they stop responding as quickly, when messages become shorter, when the presence that once seemed to occupy all the space suddenly seems distant, the most common interpretation is that the interest has waned. But most of the time, this silence is a desperate attempt to avoid saying something they don't yet know how to say. Scorpio rarely speaks of what they feel while they are still feeling it. They process it first silently, examining every angle of the situation, testing each word before deciding if it is safe enough to be spoken aloud. And while this happens, from the outside, it seems cold, it seems disinterested, it seems like an undeclared goodbye. But most of the time, what lies behind that silence is precisely the opposite, an intensity so great that he still doesn't trust himself to express it without exposing himself too much, without surrendering a power that, according to his ancient instinct, could be used against him later. This doesn't mean that all silence should be expected forever. There's a difference between silence that processes and silence that abandons, and the only way to know which one you're experiencing is to observe not the words, but the patterns. Does it return, even slowly? Does it remain present in small gestures, even when distant in grand declarations? Or does the silence simply swallow everything, leaving no trace of return? Then comes the most difficult moment in this whole story, the choice. Because Scorpio can live this cycle of approach and avoidance their whole life without ever deciding to confront it. Or you can, at some point, usually after losing something that really mattered, decide that it's time to stop protecting a wound that healed years ago. This decision is neither romantic nor instantaneous. It's a slow process of recognizing one's own pattern at the exact moment it's happening and choosing, even with fear, to stay, choosing not to retreat this time. And it's precisely at this point that transformation ceases to be astrological theory and becomes something profoundly human. The courage to remain visible even after having been hurt by being visible before. Choosing to remain visible is the bravest version of the Scorpio transformation. And that's precisely what the divine wisdom that guides your zodiac sign to a purposeful life delves into. How each sign can transform its greatest wound into purpose, instead of letting it continue to decide for you who stays and who goes. If you've come this far recognizing this pattern in yourself or someone you love, perhaps this is the missing sign you needed to act differently this time. Access is becoming increasingly restricted and may be withdrawn without prior notice. The link is in the first pinned comment. The last copies are running out. Click now and begin your journey towards the clarity and genius you deserve. There's something curious about this kind of estrangement. It almost never happens all at once. It's not a door slamming shut. It's a door that closes slowly, millimeter by millimeter, over weeks, sometimes months, until the day you realize it's been closed for a while and you just hadn't noticed the sound. This happens because Scorpio tests the distance before confirming the withdrawal. He observes if you notice the retreat. He observes if you chase after him or if you also distance yourself. He observes, above all, if your reaction confirms his old fear that intimacy always ends in abandonment, or if, on the contrary, you remain even in the face of silence, showing that perhaps this old rule is no longer true. And here's one of the hardest parts to accept in this story. Sometimes, how you reacted to the distancing was also part of the equation, not as guilt, but as a response to a response. If you also retreated, if you also protected yourself, if you also stopped showing yourself for fear of being the only vulnerable one there, that confirmed, in his eyes, exactly what he most feared confirming. There is no villain in this story. There are two protective systems reacting to each other, each trying not to be the first to get hurt again. And while both wait for the other to take the first real step, the distance continues to grow, silently, almost politely, until it seems definitive. The question that remains then is not just about what he felt, it's about what this story revealed about his own protective patterns. Because perhaps you too have learned, at some point in your life, that it's safer to retreat first than to risk being left behind. And perhaps it is precisely this encounter between two people with the same fear, disguised in different ways, that has made this story so intense and so difficult to let go of. Understanding this doesn't bring back what was lost, but it does bring back something perhaps more important, the possibility of recognizing the pattern next time, in time to choose differently. Perhaps the person who distanced themselves from you never stopped feeling. Perhaps they just haven't yet found a way to feel so intensely without feeling destroyed by it. And perhaps that doesn't change what happened, nor erase the pain of being left in the dark without explanation. But it changes the way you carry that story within you. Because understanding the mechanism isn't the same as justifying the pain it caused. It is, above all, a way to recover something that this silence took from you. The certainty that you weren't too small, nor too wrong, nor insufficient. You simply found someone at war with themselves, at a stage where that war was still winning more than losing. Scorpio teaches, perhaps more than any other sign, that the intensity that frightens is almost always the same intensity capable of healing. The same depth that makes someone disappear is the same depth that one day matured makes that same person return different, or brings into their life someone equally capable of loving without needing to run away from their own love. If you recognize this pattern in someone who has already left or in yourself, perhaps the invitation isn't to wait for the other person to change, Perhaps it's simply to allow this story to cease being an unsolved mystery and become, finally, something you understand, something you've overcome, and something from which you can, at last, be free.